Hi, Mr. Wonkin, English teacher here. Today I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite movie series of all time, The Planet of the Apes. Now, I'm old, so when I say The Planet of the Apes, I'm talking about the old Planet of the Apes. I've seen the new ones, and they're all right, but there's that sort of nostalgic wonder that I have. With the Planet of the Apes. I was very young when I first watched them, so there's that sort of naive experience that I had with them. They really blew my mind as a kid, and what I'd like to do is just kind of talk through a little bit of how the stories were structured and talk a little bit about what they mean to me, so do a little bit of analysis of them. Now, if you're not familiar with the old Planet of the Apes movies, I'm going to do a quick overview of them. There are 5 movies in the series. Of course, I'm going to severely oversimplify.
The first movie, Planet of the Apes, starring Charlton Heston, it basically goes like this. Charlton Heston and crew are on a spaceship traveling through space. They end up crash landing on a planet 2,000 years away from Earth because of relativity or something like that. They run into a group of very primitive human beings who are kind of like cave people. And then there's the big reveal. The apes ride in on horses with machine guns, and they begin to kill and or capture the primitive human beings. Charlton Heston is captured. He's separated from his crewmates, and he's put in a cage where he's experimented on. He's studied by scientists, and they give him a hot cave girl to stay in the cage with him, so a little gratuity there. He makes friends with a couple of somewhat reasonable chimpanzees named Zira and Cornelius, and then we get the big reveal from him. He hadn't been speaking because he had an injury. I think he was grazed by a bullet and it messed up his vocal cords during the hunt, so he hadn't spoken. None of the other humans speak, and then we get this big reveal to the apes that he can talk, and we get the famous line here.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
So the apes can't decide what to do with him. He's clearly intelligent, he's articulate, but they don't know. He's a human being, and humans are just brute animals to them. So do they kill him, or do they give him a place in society as the intelligent being that he is? Most of them really want to kill him. And so the argument kind of ensues back and forth. He ends up escaping with the hot cave girl and a machine gun in his warm living hands. And we end with him finding the Statue of Liberty, and he realizes this is the Earth. He came back to the Earth. He didn't go to some other planet out in space. He ended up in the Earth 2,000 years from when he left it.
You maniacs! You blew it up!
Overall, this movie is a little cheesy. Well, it's really cheesy, let's be honest. But it's actually a pretty good production. The cinematography is decent. There are some things that are pretty bad about it. I mean, there's a lot of kind of gratuitous stuff, like too many close-ups, too many weird angles, but that was kind of popular in the 1960s when this came out. And then, of course, you have the hot cave girl with her animal skin bikini that she's wearing, which is very gratuitous. The acting is a little hammy for some of the people, Charlton Heston, for instance. But some of the acting is actually pretty good. The set is another thing that's kind of funny. It makes the ape civilization look like it's like a summer camp. It's like ape summer camp. It's so small. It's clearly on a very small bit of land that's being used as a film studio. So it's a little goofy, but for the most part, it's pretty good cinematography, and the concept is very interesting. So that's the first movie.
The second movie is called Beneath the Planet of the Apes. And in Beneath the Planet of the Apes, we have a Charlton Heston lookalike as the main character. He's younger and hotter than Charlton Heston, and he has come in on a second spaceship to try to find Charlton Heston and his crew. He ends up meeting the hot cave girl, We go through some of the same shenanigans with them going into ape summer camp and making friends with Zira and Cornelius and the other apes wanting to kill them. They escape, and they end up going into this underground network of tunnels. I don't know if they're supposed to be sewers or some kind of plumbing or something like that. But they go through these tunnels and they find this group of weird psychic people. And these people worship a bomb, and they have this ability to control people's minds. So they start to do this weird manipulation to the main character. They make him try to kill the hot cave girl. They make him, there's a reveal here, Charlton Heston is being held captive by them. They make him fight Charlton Heston. They make them try to kill each other. The apes find these people because while the main character and the hot cave girl are interacting with the weird psychic people, the apes are looking for them. So they find these people, a fight ensues, and the end is really bizarre in this one. Charlton Heston sets off this atomic bomb that these weird psychic people worship, and he destroys the planet of the apes. It's kind of unclear whether it was intentional or whether it was accidental. I think it's supposed to have been accidental.
This is an interesting one. It's probably the weirdest of the series. These psychic people are really bizarre, and the makeup is really interesting. The cinematography is really bizarre, really out there. It's kind of over the top, but I think this is really my favorite film of the 5. And I think it really sticks with me because as a kid, it really haunted me. The idea of these psychic people being able to control what you're seeing and what you're doing, to me that was extremely troubling, especially when it got to the point that he was trying to kill the girl and he was trying to kill Charlton Heston, and he didn't have control of himself. So that really troubled me as a kid, the idea that someone could take control of your mind and force you to harm someone that you care about. That really, really bothered me. So that one ends with just a washout, like everybody's destroyed. Really, really over the top, really bizarre film.
The third movie, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, goes in a different direction. We go back to present day or 1970s Earth. So what happens is Zira and Cornelius, the two reasonable chimpanzees, they end up repairing Charlton Heston's spaceship somehow, and they fly it back, and somehow they find some kind of time warp in space that takes them back 2,000 years to Earth in 1973. So everybody's surprised. There are these monkeys on this spaceship, and then, again, the reveal, they can talk, and everybody's kind of amazed by it, right? And everybody's kind of excited about it at first. They invite them to these parties. They get to meet all these famous people. They get to meet all these world leaders. It's very exciting stuff until the humans start to hear about the fact that the apes had taken over the world and that the humans had become these beasts and that the apes were treating them pretty badly. So they also find out that Zira is pregnant. So they decide to do two things: abort the baby and basically neuter Zira and Cornelius so that they don't have children that grow up to be, intelligent apes that take over the world. Zira and Cornelius end up escaping. They switch their baby with a baby chimp in the circus. And then the movie ends with them being killed with the chimp baby. And everybody thinks it's over. So no more talking apes, right? And so that takes us to Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, which is really a pretty simple film. In Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, the son of Zira and Cornelius grows up, and he realizes that humans have been breeding the apes to be larger and more adept physically so that they can perform, basically, so that they can act as slaves. And so the son of Zira and Cornelius, his name is Caesar, he instigates a rebellion, and all of the apes overthrow the human beings. And that's pretty much all there is to it, and they win at the end, so it ends with them destroying human civilization.
Now, a couple things about these two movies. Escape from the Planet of the Apes is kind of interesting, and it really stands out from all the other 5 in that we don't have the hot cave girl, right? And Zira is arguably the protagonist, or she kind of shares that with Cornelius a little bit, but she's really the most significant character in a lot of ways. So it's maybe got a little bit of feminism in it. But in the 4th movie, we completely go against that because there are hardly any women in the movie at all. Conquest of the Planet of the Apes is kind of interesting. There are a couple of weird things about it. A lot of the apes are dressed in red jumpsuits, which I remember as a kid thinking, well, no wonder they rebelled. They're all wearing red, these really, really deep red. That's got to put them in a weird state of mind. This is really the darkest of all of the movies. There's some interesting, a lot of dark scenes, a lot of dark colors, and all of the scenes are enclosed. So they're either in interiors or they're in a sort of a city setting where there are buildings all around. So there aren't any natural scenes outside of an urban environment. And so I think that kind of gives you that sense of this is the world that the apes are rebelling against, a world that is controlled and contained and in a cage, so to speak.
We come to number 5, the last film, probably the weakest of the 5, and it's called Battle for the Planet of the Apes. In Battle for the Planet of the Apes, we have apes and humans are living together in a treehouse city. So it's kind of like Ape Summer Camp, except they're all living in treehouses in this one. They call it Ape City. In the urban city with the skyscrapers and all that kind of stuff, there are a group of mutant humans living. So that's kind of a hint at these being the ancestors of the psychic mutants that were in the second movie. And we have some kind of weird social dynamics in this ape-human society. The gorillas want to kill or enslave the humans. The other apes don't necessarily agree with that, although there's some debate. So we have some of that conflict going on. At the same time, the mutant humans who live in the city, they decide that they want to go attack. So while the ape and human society living in Ape City is kind of struggling over where humans fit in the society, do we let humans have a voice and have power? They get attacked by this group of mutant human beings, and so they all have to band together to fight off the mutant human beings. And so at the end we have, they fought together against the evil humans, and so now the good humans and the apes can be friends. And they do this weird thing where they have all these guns, they put them in this storage building, and they say they're just going to leave them there and lock the door until one day when there's no longer any danger in the world. And then the last scene, we have an orangutan telling the story to a group of human and ape kids. So like we're all living together, and are we ever going to have a world where there isn't any danger?
So this last movie was interesting here. The clear contrast, it's kind of almost like Gothic in the sense of that, like we have this urban architectural location is where the evil is. So the evil mutant humans live in this architectural caged location, whereas the good humans and the apes with their kind of utopian society are living out in a natural, agrarian, farm life type of society. This last film is, like I said, it's the worst. This last one looks very much like a television show. So it's the worst production of the whole series. And that may not mean anything to people who watch a lot of Netflix and stuff like that. Nowadays, television series are very well produced, but back in the 60s and 70s, well into the 80s and 90s, television series were low budget, so the production values weren't that wonderful. They didn't look quite as clean, and they weren't quite as elaborately designed as far as the cinematography work was. So this last film was very simplistic. The cinematography was very unremarkable. The ending is very ambiguous. We have this idea that we know that in the future that Charlton Heston went to in the first movie, the apes have taken over. So, and then we also have the mutant humans. There are a few of them still left in the city that are dressed very similarly to the mutant psychic people in the second movie. So the implication is that we do have the stage set for what's going to happen later in the Planet of the Apes that we saw in the first two movies. So it's kind of a ambiguous type of thing, and I think that's kind of the idea that like the future is up to us. What we decide to do may determine that. So what is it all about? And I think there's some things to look at in the way the story works that really kind of get to. I think in a lot of ways it's very obvious thematically. And so if you look at the way the story is designed, so you have a very generalized representation of human civilization in the ape society. So you have a three-part society. You've got orangutans, who are sort of the politically elite, the lawyers, the priests. They're very traditional and they're conservative. You have the gorillas, and the gorillas are the muscle. So they're the police, they're the military, and to some extent they're kind of like the labor class, and they're kind of brutish and violent, quick to anger. And then you have the third group, which is the chimpanzees. And the chimpanzees are like the kind of middle ground. They're presented as, in terms of the role they play in society, they're sort of the academics, the scientists, the intellectuals. But they're also sort of the largest portion of society, right? So they're in between the sort of old power of the orangutans and the sort of brute power of the gorillas. So basically it works like this. The elite orangutans waste their intellectual energy on maintaining the status quo, right? So this is kind of the old style. This is the old-fashioned reactionary point of view, right? They're intelligent. They're an intelligent part of the society, but they're not really using that intelligence to make any meaningful changes or to solve any problems. They're making sure that things stay the way that they are. And they have seduced the gorillas, which are very animalistic and brutish, with the power that they give them as police and military, right? They use them to enforce the tradition that they're trying to keep, which keeps them in power, right? And then the chimpanzees are, like I said, they're in between that. They're the sort of middle ground. The chimpanzees are where the hope lies. So the chimpanzees, they're a larger part of the population, so maintaining the status quo relies on their cooperation with the system as is. You know, so they are the ones that if they all decided to go a different direction, well, they have the numbers, and so they would be able to make changes. But if they don't, then everything stays the way it is, right? So the chimpanzees seem to be the sort of average person, you know, the kind of the middle class. They're intelligent, they're able, but a lot of them are on board with what the orangutans and the gorillas are doing. So although some of them want to make some changes. And so we see in Zira and Cornelius, basically, society coming face to face with the reality that this group that they have treated as brute animals all this time has potential to be more than that, right? Society coming to face with that reality that maybe it isn't what they thought it was. So maybe we need to rethink the way we look at humans and our relationship with them. And so the obvious theme there, we have, starting from the first movie, we have Charlton Heston coming to this planet and realizing that everything's upside down, right? You know, we have treated apes like this for so many years, and we experiment on them, and we kill them, and we keep them as pets. And this is what's happening to human beings. And now I have to face this myself. It's kind of like a Twilight Zone ending, you know, that like the consequences of your actions are ironically apropos to the mistakes that you made, right? So we begin with that. And so here is Charlton Heston, a white male, a man who is a member of the power of the power class, so to speak, coming into a situation in which he is being treated like an animal. And so how does it feel is kind of the idea. You know, we've treated animals this way for so long. See how it feels, right? This is what it's like. And in some ways it gets really brutal. There's a point at which he finds one of his shipmates in a museum, and he realizes all of the human figures in the museum. So think of a museum with animals, like the little scenes set up with animals, and they have these human scenes set up, and the humans are actually alive, but they've been lobotomized, so they're just standing there. which is really twisted. But it's him sort of seeing himself in the place of the way animals and the way humans have treated them for however long, right? Most of the plots, at least the plots of the first 3 or 4 films, basically are driven by powerless individuals trying to prove their own value and trying to gain rights as living beings. And the irony is pretty heavy in the first one with Charlton Heston, and then in the second one with the younger, hotter Charlton Heston lookalike, that these are white men trying to fight for their rights and be treated normally. But that's basically the idea. And then we have in the Escape from the Planet of the Apes, we have the apes coming to Earth and sort of expressing themselves and saying, hey, look, we can talk too, we're intelligent, we can interact. But then people get afraid when they realize that Zira is pregnant because they don't want the apes to, get too much power, right? And then, of course, in the fourth movie, the apes overthrow the humans, and that is the shift. And then we get in the last film a completely different point of view and a completely different plot element, in that the question isn't how does a powerless group gain power, or how does a powerless group convince the powered group to give them rights. The question is, how do we build a society in which those types of problematic dynamics don't become problematic? Can we build a society in which the apes and the humans can interact and be okay together and cooperate with each other? So the last one is a really different, but it makes sense as a close to the whole concept, right? And so essentially the films are dealing with, what does it mean to be an outsider, right? And is it possible to build society in a way that doesn't perpetuate and develop entire populations of underprivileged individuals, right? The interesting thing, and I think because it wasn't really thinking about this, but the film kind of ignores economics. So you don't see, like, for instance, the orangutans are, politicians and priests. The chimpanzees are scientists and teachers. The gorillas are police and soldiers. Where's the economic? Where's the banks? Where's the, so I would add, if we're going to do the analogy, I would add, bankers and corporate leaders and stuff like that, and I would put them into the group of the orangutans, because that is the power structure of our society now. But I think that's kind of an interesting thing that was left out. And another thing that's kind of weird, and I think it's something, I don't know if it was intentional, and I don't know if, not really sure how to interpret it, but the apes consistently, in all of the movies except for Escape from the Planet of the Apes, when Zira and Cornelius come back to present-day Earth, all of the apes wear uniforms, basically. So in the first 2 movies, the chimpanzees wear a specific type of uniform. The orangutans wear a certain type of uniform. The gorillas wear a certain type of uniform. When Zira and Cornelius come back to present-day Earth in the third film, they wear just regular clothes. So that's the only time when that doesn't happen. But when we get into the fourth movie with the Ape Rebellion and Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, they're all dressed in basically jumpsuits. So they're slaves and they're wearing workers' jumpsuits. In the last film, and here's where it just seems out of place, they're building a new society, and they haven't built the ape society that we saw in the first 2 films, because we've got humans and apes working together, and yet still the orangutans are dressed in a uniform, a certain uniform. The chimpanzees are dressed in a certain uniform, and the gorillas are dressed in a certain uniform. There's some slight variations, but it's pretty standard that they all dress in similar ways. So Not really sure what the idea is. That a hint that maybe we're moving into the structured society that was in the first two films, that's going to turn out that way eventually. I don't know if that was intentional, or I don't know if it was just because they thought the audience was familiar with it at that point and they continued with it. But that's an interesting element that, I don't know how intentional or what they really wanted to do with that. But I think the Planet of the Apes it's outdated, it's old, it's cheesy. But there's still a lot to look at and there's a lot to think about in terms of society. In the society in which we live, in which there are certainly groups of people, narrow groups of people who have power, and broad groups of people who do not. And there's a lot to discuss in terms of, is that power legitimate? Do we have to discount the people who don't have power? Is it meaningful to do so? And we can look at this in terms of, skin color. And I think if you look at it in the context, 1968, when this came out, the civil rights was still a big deal. I mean, we were still pushing to make changes in our society to how different ethnic groups were viewed. And so I think definitely the writer of the book in 1963, the novel that it was based on, was certainly thinking about those kind of things. And then the filmmaker was certainly thinking about those things as well, because these issues were big. These issues were really important. Those issues are still important, right? And so I think we can look at it, and it's a little on the nose sometimes, but it is still thought-provoking. And there's definitely some interesting presentations of it and some interesting conversations between the characters in terms of who do we see as capable of intelligence, and do we discount people because we don't see them as capable of intelligence? I mean, like, what is the reason? So they treat the humans the way they treat the humans because the humans seem to be not very intelligent. But are they not intelligent because they haven't been given the chance? Are they not intelligent because they've punished them for talking? And so there are some interesting questions. And in Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, there's a great moment at the end when one of the human leaders, an African American gentleman, talks about, and like I said, it's a little on the nose, but he talks about his own ancestry and slavery in the United States, and he talks about that with Caesar in terms of, what's the difference? That maybe we can treat each other with compassion. And so there's an interesting conversation there about that.
Caesar, this is not how it was to be.
In your view or mine?
Violence prolongs hate, hate prolongs violence. By what right are you spilling blood?
By the slave's right to punish his persecutors.
Caesar, I, a descendant of slaves, am asking you to show humanity.
But I was not born human.
And so I think it's kind of obvious that they're dealing with that kind of thing, but you can also think about it in terms of, economic power. You can think about it in terms of any marginalized group, women, gay and lesbian people, transgender people. You can think about what's going on in these films in terms of any of those types of structures of power dynamics in society, and there absolutely are those systems in our society. So I think it's still thought-provoking. I think it's still interesting, and it's just fun, cheesy sci-fi. So anyway, that's what I think about Planet of the Apes. I'm interested in hearing what other people think, people who've watched it. If you haven't watched it, check it out, and let me know what you think. Let me know if I missed anything, if there's anything I'm not getting about it. And thanks a lot.